with about an hour of each other. But through over the years, you know, David, you might pass a job off to Dan or to Darren, and Dan, you might ask David or Darren to help. Can you talk a little bit about it's, you know, working together, cooperation, not competition?
Whenever I get someone bad on the phone, I always send them to Dave. That's always been my strategy.
Well, I suppose permaculture activists and designers are renowned as individualist operators who just sort of do their own thing. And I think, you know, we're a bit like that as characters, but we've also done that connect and pass work from one to another, and also mentoring and peer review sort of process in a very informal, you know, ad hoc way. And I think this place was probably bringing some of those things together a little bit.
Yeah, definitely.
So Dan, this is one of your clients here at Yandoi?
Yeah, which Michael and Lisa, who were originally referred to me by David and Sue, and then once I checked it out, the first thing was, why don't we get Darren involved? And then we were lucky enough to have David come later in the piece. And for me, that was great because they both brought skill sets that I don't have and I'm, you know, aspiring to. So it was a great professional development opportunity for me.
Yeah, and Dan, you identified that here's an opportunity and a possibility with what Lisa and Michael were saying and the nature of the land, that possibly some substantial earthworks and keyline, and that was critical of getting Darren involved. So, you know, that lots of possibilities here, but there's been, you know, major works that's been based on your design.
Yeah, and I think that's, I mean, it's a reflection ultimately that I think we all acknowledge we know what we don't know, and we're pretty mature about that. And so, you know, if you know, I'm a 15mm spanner that Dan needed, and then he got the 25mm over here, you know, up the road. So it just sort of works like that, you know. If you need a particular skill set or toolbox, well then, you know, we're open enough. And I mean, I've always really enjoyed that and appreciated that adage or that axiom of cooperation, not competition, because, well, we've always said that if we reach peak permaculture, well then, you know, it'll be a great time, you know, but we're certainly a long way off that. Yeah, so
this year we got a lot of feedback. We did a tour, overseas tour, and we got a lot of feedback about clients who had spent a lot of money on designs and earthworks that, you know, blew out, or that they didn't think was, you know, the amount of cash that they'd spent, they thought it just wasn't. I wondered what you guys think about. Do you think that an inexperienced person who does a 2-week permaculture course really should be designing professionally for clients if they're doing earthworks?
Well, I suppose I've been talking about that issue since the early days of permaculture design courses, because there, you know, was this early enthusiasm about go out and conquer the world because you can't do any worse than, you know, what's happening out there. And to some extent, that's how we've got people who have, you know, self-taught, learning on the job,
innovated pretty heavily.
Yeah, and experimented and discounted away their charge rates to people because they're in a learning mode. But it's also had a whole lot of collateral damage over the years of people going and sort of, you know, trying to do things that they didn't really understand, or taking the other thing of taking experience that they had in a particular landscape or environment with particular soils and just projecting it off into somewhere else in the world that it didn't actually work quite that way. And I think that's, you know, the main problem. So of course it's always a buyer beware situation. You've got to look at the individual person. What is their lineage? Where is their experience stronghold. Where are they, like, what's their home base? And if you're getting someone from the other side of the world, sometimes, maybe they don't actually sort of have that local knowledge. I think most people have ended up who've had those experiences have, to some extent, selected themselves back, either gone back to the drawing board with their own training, or decided, oh, well, this is not for me. So I don't think it's been as bad a problem as, maybe it could have been, with the idea that, yes, 2 weeks design course and go out and reconfigure landscapes on a large scale. Maybe reconfigure your backyard.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's sort of, the start small and build up.
Dan, did you have a personal experience with something like this?
Yeah, I mean, I was the case, and we see a lot of that. I came out of my first permaculture design course with a lot of momentum, and fairly early on got involved in a project where we but to a degree, I guess the confidence exceeded the competence, and so we're involved in some works that, in retrospect, weren't the best. In that particular case, the overall project went fine and whatnot, but it was certainly a case of going back to the drawing board for me, taking a year out to really think about it, and then come back in a more mature way, and with a keener ability to know where I was at, where my skill level started and stopped, and when it was time to bring in the appropriate expertise. But one thing we stress with others, and it was also part of my story, was you're going to make mistakes. That's part of the learning process. But try and make them small. Don't go out and make big mistakes.
And of course, where possible, most of those mistakes should be the mistakes you make on your own patch, or in my case, one of the things I did on my mother's property, which was in a way over relying on so-called expertise, in that case the Soil Conservation Authority of New South Wales, that I thought, well, these guys are the expert dam builders, and we built a dam, an 8-metre high wall that sat empty in the drought for 4 years and then filled in 24 hours and just completely blew out. And it was like a hole in my head for a few years as we, repaired that. But,
That's why you don't work for relatives, David. Because you can never get someone so honest. Yeah, I think it's always that difficulty. You get a lot of people at the PDC is a really exciting thing for people. It's life changing. It's a breathtaking opportunity, and you don't want to sort of have it so that people suffer some sort of inertia at the end of it, where you're sort of warning them off doing all sorts of things. So but at the same time, you need to. Well, the way I feel is that you need to still have people feel responsible and feel a responsibility to what they're doing. Just the fact that they're using energy. I mean, just use energy really responsibly. Their own energy, fossil energy, etc. Try and use that really effectively, and not get too ahead of yourself. It's like, I don't know, it was William McDonough or Sim van der Rijn. One of their principles of ecology is that everyone is a designer. Everyone should feel like they're a designer, and that's one of the great things about humans, is that we're incredibly creative species, and you don't want to stop people being that, but you sort of also want to just remind people to live within their limits.
Yeah, and some of that what you find on a permaculture design course, you get someone who comes along who's already an architect, and they're taking on the whole permaculture framework. Well, they're already an architect,
They're already a design professional.
Yeah. Or you get someone even who's an earth moving contractor. Well, they can just sort of go at it. They've got,
but they may not get the tree stuff, or they may not get the... Yeah.
That's right. So there's different ways in which a permaculture designer has a holistic overview, but they've still usually... They're a jack of all trades, but at best, they're a master of one trade as well.
Yeah.
And that they get acknowledged in the wider world for that skill set, but they're bringing that, holistic overview.
I think sometimes people feel like they need to be all things to all people.
Yeah.
And in the way that, they need to be able to answer every question with some sort of, sometimes often a cliche.
Yeah.
And that's...
Well,
yeah,
this of course happens also with people who are very quickly elevated as expertise. And I heard a story recently about Peter Andrews, who I have a great respect for his, vision and work, but it was one of those things of being put on the spot and asked about something that he probably didn't really actually have much knowledge of, and
But still gave
feeling
an
like
opinion.
he needed to say something deep and meaningful about it. And of course we've all had that experience when we're in the spotlight, and so there's definitely many pitfalls, but perhaps the biggest one is people seeing permaculture as just a set of techniques that are universal, and that whether it's the swale or whether it's some particular tree or something, like a Tagasasti is a permaculture tree.
A keyline flower.
Yeah, that these things apply everywhere, and of course they don't.
No.
And in some places they're actually completely inappropriate. So it's the ethics and the design principles that are universal in permaculture, but the techniques and the strategies vary radically around the world. So
That's what we spend a lot of time reminding people about, or how we feel about the whole permaculture thing is that, come in, Dan, you're out of frame, mate. But the whole permaculture thing is a system of ethics and design principles, and don't get too far away from that. All of the techniques and stuff are just things that you use as part of that thinking.
For an example of that, people have sometimes come to Meliadora and said, "Where are the swales?" And I say, well, we're in a winter rainfall climate where the only time the soil is really gets substantial runoff that would collect in a swale usefully, the soil's already saturated and it's a cool climate where things aren't growing so much. So whereas you go to the tropics and the subtropics, you can get this torrential downpour, water sheet off ground even that's fully vegetated, and water hasn't got into the soil. So a swale's a great thing, but in our climate it's sort of, well, yes, in some situations it's really appropriate, but mostly it doesn't work so well. And then I teach that, but if we get climate change to more erratic and unreliable winter rainfall, but a more occasional torrential summer downpours, then yes, swales start to become more appropriate. And then of course there's the variance of each site and the soil, and so it's never a sort of like,
It's never a cookie cutter.
yeah.
So speaking about swales, do you think that the overuse of swales, because we've always felt this sort of swale-centric energy, but especially this year travelling around, it seemed like it was just out of
advanced.
control.
Yeah,
Do you think that the overuse of swales is simply a lack of hydrology of soil? Do you think it's like a silver bullet approach where we're just, one size fits all?
Well, I think that's the tendency. And of course, if you get expert in something, we can see examples of where people have developed really good systems that really work very well on their own patch. And I suppose someone who's out of the box in terms of permaculture design but hasn't come through the design course lineage, and that's Sepp Holzer from Austria. And, he had the almost indigenous knowledge of place and then his own radical ideas and developed systems, but certainly he had those problems when he went out as a consultant into completely different climates. And, like in Portugal, some doubts about, whether large open water shallow dams
Basins,
are actually evaporating too much water in that climate to be, so useful. And so I think the going from this has worked somewhere and therefore it should work everywhere is a serious problem. And I suppose the bigger you do something, with earthworks, the bigger the mistakes you can make. If you're digging a swale by hand, well, it's, you can't make,
You're not
much
gonna-
of
you're not gonna go
a
so far.
mistake. But when you're doing it with an excavator, then those issues can be.
I think
greater.
it's a lack of due diligence. I mean, when you do these things, they're engineering. I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately they're engineering, and one big thing in engineering is due diligence. You follow a really clear process. And we have about 25 steps to building a dam, and the first 5 of those don't involve building the dam. So they're all about testing and checking and all of that sort of stuff. And I don't see any difference with what people do with swales. I look at what the soil conservation people did back in the time. I mean, they had the engineers go out first, and then the dozers came in second. So there was a process, and even then they got some of that wrong, because they tried to apply a sort of a carte blanche approach. I think again, it sort of there's a sense of urgency out there. And a lot of the time, people are sent on their way out of a course or by watching a video or something. They're sort of given that sense of urgency, and so they feel like they need to do something. And when we used to do it back in the day, we always used to plant acacias, because if I just planted eucalypts or something like that, then the client would come back in 2 years' time and they'd have a tree this high. And so if I mixed it up with some acacias, well, then they'd feel really good about it. They go, wow, this guy's a genius, right? And in some ways, I see that this sort of stuff is, let's get some earthworks done, because it's all wow, and it's, when you get a machine on the job, it's amazing how much. I've been doing it for all my life, and it still never ceases to amaze me how much work you can get done in the blink of an eye. I mean, humans just can't work that quick, and it's like, oh my goodness. But if you don't know what you're doing, you're in a lot of trouble, and so it does give people a sense of achievement. But achievement at what cost? And really, ultimately, was it really necessary? Are we addressing the core needs of the water cycle here? Are we working on the effect, or are we working on the cause? And that's something that you and I have talked about a lot, in particular, Dan.
Yeah. I mean, overall, one thing I see a lot in permaculture is there's the very general emphasis on ethics, principles, and pattern literacy, and then there's a whole suite of techniques and strategies. And the only thing that gets you from the former to the latter is the design process, and I feel like that's over time, the way permaculture's evolved, that's been de-emphasised. You need to come back to that, because that's what gets you from the general stuff to the specific stuff that's relevant to this place and these people right now. And that's always the question of, what's the function? What are we trying to achieve here?
Well, that's all. It reminds me of the thing I used to say to a lot of clients, and a lot of the work I did in the early years was actually just one day on-site advisory work for people getting set up on small rural properties where you could give very good value for money before the days of being able to generate sort of accurate plans and everything. And I'd say, don't tell me about the land, but I need to know about you folks, because you are your land's best asset and greatest liability. That if you're not looking at what the people are, where are they at, so that no
context.
technique or whether it's biological or earth moving or whatever is relevant unless it relates to the people. Like you say, oh, well, you really need, a great mob of goats here on, well, if people aren't animal people, that's probably a wrong place to start, So I used to think, I have this little mental note. Is this person a plant person, an animal person, a people person, or a sort of a tech machine person? I sort of wanted to put them in, it's a bit artificial, but it's also, well, where's the place to start? And starting with where people are at is the only place you can start.
Where the land's
yeah,
at too.
so the land is, it's the land
I
is...
look at it like you've got the human context, and then you've got the landscape context, and you've got to, part of this is trying to bring those two things together.
And at the best, as a consultant, you're not actually asking the client about the land, unless, of course, they're a long-term farmer who's... But often when people are starting, it's, as a designer, you need the skills in reading landscape to actually make those assessment, so you're not just inheriting the biases and the things that people want to do, that they're passionate about, or that they think are really important. Yeah, you need to look at the land on its own terms, without that, and then how for those to come together.
And don't design it on how it is now, but if you regenerate the soil and it's going to absorb more water, like a lot of people design for how it looks now, but if you're doing a little bit of regeneration, it's going to be totally different.
I agree. I had this discussion with some Indigenous people a few years ago in Northern Territory about the role of fire in a lot of their landscapes, where the landscapes have so radically changed as a result of this moment in time where we've had European livestock management, which has decimated the soils and the ecology such that in some cases now the use of fire is an inappropriate tool, whereas when it was under their domain, it had some applicability, and so you have to change your tools, even though they were once culturally appropriate. Or if you come to a landscape and you look at it and it's only got 1.5% carbon, and everything sheds off it, it's going to function a lot differently to when it's got 2% carbon and when the water actually infiltrates. So you got it. I don't know. It's like, for me, that sort of realisation was a pretty big one, because you fall into that master plan-y sort of overshoot thing, as opposed to dealing with the whole and then starting to work with it.
Yep.
And start to roll with the place as it improves.
And the people too, as they
absolutely,
change and evolve,
as
and
the skill set builds
find their bliss in the bigger picture.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, 3D's.
3D's.
D-cubed.
Yeah. Well, now we'll get back to some what is it? Unidentifiable deer.
Yeah.
Some of your venison with a 308.
I was thinking about it, and I decided that I'm a 5 mil Allen key.
5 mil Allen key.